The 1938 World Cup was chaotic. If you enjoy this video, please drop a like and remember to subscribe for more videos like these. Probably the most politically intense time to hold a World Cup. At the dawn of the Second World War, the third edition of the World Cup was held in 1938. The 1938 World Cup was held in France, the home of Jules Rimet and Henri Delaney, the founders of the World Cup, after they beat Germany and Argentina in a vote in 1936. Took that well, didn't they? So let's get straight into qualification. As with the world being in absolute turmoil, the qualification groups were chaotic. A couple of teams who didn't take part in qualification include Italy and France, as they went through by being the host and defending champions. The home nations, England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, still refused to take part as they held the British Home Championship in higher prestige. Egypt, whose World Cup story so far had been nothing short of crazy, including missing out on the 1930 World Cup due to a storm and then losing to Hungary in 1934, withdrew from qualification as their game against Romania was being played during Ramadan. Meanwhile in Spain, they were too busy having a civil war. Austria had qualified after beating Latvia, who beat Lithuania to play Austria. However, after Germany's annexation of the country, they missed out. Latvia weren't even offered the spot. Instead, that spot was offered to England, who rejected. And they still didn't offer it to Latvia. Therefore, the World Cup was going to be short of one team. Now, because the World Cup was taking part in Europe for a second time in a row, pretty much every nation outside of the continent, especially in the Americas, were fuming. Led by South America's two best sides, Argentina and Uruguay, Costa Rica, Chile, Colombia, Dutch Guyana, El Salvador, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, and the United States all boycotted the tournament before the qualifiers. As did Japan, who at the time were involved in the Second Sino-Japanese War, meaning outside of Europe, Brazil took part, continuing their 100% attendance record, but also Cuba and the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, would take part for the very first time. USA were offered a late entry into the World Cup if they could beat the Dutch East Indies, similar to their defeat of Mexico 4 years prior, however they rejected the offer. So the 15 participants in the 1938 World Cup were as follows: France, Italy, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Poland, Romania, Switzerland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands, Belgium, Brazil, Cuba and the Dutch East Indies. The draw was held in Paris on the 5th of March 1938. Germany, France, Italy, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Cuba and Brazil were seeded for the draw, and Sweden were given a bye as they would have been Austria's opponents. Much like the 1934 World Cup, the 1938 World Cup was a single elimination knockout tournament, and the opening game happened on the 4th of June in Paris' Parc des Princes as Switzerland faced Germany. As Germany had recently annexed Austria, a large part of the German side was a part of the Austrian side in the 1934 World Cup, who, as we discussed previously, were very good. 5 players who represented Austria previously played for Germany in this game, and the German coach Sepp Herberger played the standard WM formation. However, although Austria did play the same formation, a problem was found instantly. The Austrians viewed the centre-half position to be aggressive and attacking, whereas the Germans viewed them as the exact opposite. The 3 weeks of training prior to the World Cup was never going to be enough time to work on this problem. Switzerland, on the other hand, were very different. A side full of confidence after beating England at the World Cup, Switzerland were tactically superior and set up as a side difficult to beat, as their coach was, ironically, Austrian Karl Rappan, the founder of Veru, the tactic that influenced Gipo Viani's infamous Catenaccio. Rappan looked for a system based on hard work as opposed to individual ability, benefiting the amateur footballers at the time, and there was no confusion over how the centre-halves are meant to play. 1 defensive sweeper and 4 man-marking defenders. With the 5 former Austrians in their side, Germany really struggled. The crowd in Paris were heavily against the Germans as bottles were being thrown at them. However, they'd still take the lead through Josef Gaucho, but Switzerland equalised prior to half-time thanks to Andre Abeglen. Germany just could not break the Swiss down, and their frustrations boiled over into extra time when former Austrian centre-forward Johann Pesser lashed out at a Swiss player, and he was sent off by John Longinus, the 1930 World Cup final referee. 1-1 was how it remained, and a replay was played 5 days later, with the infamous Ivan Eklund refereeing the game. Germany made 6 changes, adding 3 more Austrians into the side, but with an entirely German defence, the result was embarrassing. Germany took a quick 2-0 lead, but completely capitulated, especially in the second half, and they'd lose 4-2. An absolute kick in the teeth for the Nazi regime, but a wonderful win for the Swiss. Manager Herberger blamed the Austrians, and this would be the last World Cup fixture for a unified Germany until 1994. The remaining round of 16 games were all played the very next day, and where best to start than the Stade Velodrome in Marseille, as Norway came up against world champions Italy. Not only were Italy world champions, they were also Olympic champions after beating Austria in 1936. However, their team was drastically different from their controversial triumph in 1934. Only 4 players from their 1934 squad remained, and 2 members of that squad had fled the country to avoid national service. Nevertheless, unlike 1934, Italy weren't as reliant on the recruitment of foreign players, known as Oriundi, with Uruguayan-born Miguel Andriolo being the only player in the squad born outside of Italy. Manager Pozzo stuck to his WW formation, and with Giuseppe Meazza and Serie A's all-time top scorer Silvio Piola in the side, Pozzo had his best Italy side yet. Norway were a strange team. Bronze medalists in the 1936 Olympics, they were quite an inconsistent side, recently beating Finland, Sweden, the Irish Free State and Germany in the only game Adolf Hitler ever attended, but they also recently lost to Denmark, Italy and England. They clearly had the ability to give Italy a good game, but could they beat them? Much like the Germany-Switzerland game, the fans had their clear favourites, and it wasn't Benito Mussolini's Italy. Although evidence years later proved Pozzo wasn't a fascist himself, he still told his side to carry on with the fascist salute until the spectators, who were majority exiled Italians living in Marseille, stopped booing and whistling prior to the game. According to Pozzo himself, this was to confirm we had no fear. Having won the battle of intimidation, we played. Italy took the lead after 2 minutes through Pietro Ferraris, but they couldn't kill the game off. The game was a tight affair, and with just 7 minutes remaining, one of Norway's greatest players, Arne Brustad, ran past the entire Italian defence to slot in the equaliser. Minutes later, he'd score a second, however it was controversially disallowed for offside. Given their relationship with Italy at the time, the fact the referee for this game was German has raised questions ever since. Nevertheless, the game went into extra time, where Piola pounced on a goalkeeping error and Italy held on to win 2-1. Much to the annoyance of the spectators, and the Italian side were required a strong police escort to their vehicles. Italy may have won the game, but Norway certainly won the hearts of many, and various countries after offered to play friendlies against them. When the host France faced Belgium in Colombes, some interesting characters took part. The absolute goal machine John Nicholas was still leading the line for France, yet he wasn't the star of this side. That honour went to France's first black player, Raoul Diagne, a player who could genuinely play anywhere, including goalkeeper, as he did for a brief spell in his side, Racing Club's title-winning season. Diagne was a maverick, a tall, imposing and attacking defender that would often switch places with the right winger, but importantly, he was a pioneer in the French game. As for Belgium, Raymond Brain finally got the chance to represent his country at the World Cup. If you remember, Brain actually missed the 1930 World Cup because he opened a cafe, and he missed the 1934 World Cup as he was playing his football in Czechoslovakia. Although he very nearly did play for the Czechoslovaks in 1934, as they offered him citizenship, which he rejected. France won the game comfortably 3-1 thanks to a goal inside the first minute and a Jean Nicolas brace. The losing finalists from 1934 Czechoslovakia faced off against the Netherlands. Understandably the favourites despite their poor run of form, the Czechs could not convert their dominance into goals and the game went into extra time at 0-0. In this 30-minute spell, however, they truly made the Dutch pay, scoring 3 unanswered goals, and the top scorer from the previous World Cup, Aldrich Nahedli, added to his World Cup goal scoring tally by scoring the final goal of the game. Now we get to one of the more dominant games, yet it involved one of the most interesting sides in World Cup history. Hungary were no doubt one of the best sides in the world, having beaten Czechoslovakia, Austria and Switzerland to win the most recent Central European Cup. Not to mention their 11-1 victory over Greece in qualification, they could rely on an attack that involved Europe's top scorer at the time, Gyula Zengelia and Georgi Sarasi. They were not just heavy favourites for the game, but they were many people's pick for this World Cup. Whereas their opponents, the Dutch East Indies, had only ever officially played 3 games in their entire history, and hadn't even played one for 4 years. The Dutch East Indies, who were under the colonial rule of, you guessed it, the Dutch, became the first Asian side to play at the World Cup. Their team consisted mostly of amateurs, but according to the son of squad member Isaac Patiwell, the Dutch would have rather chose players of their own. However, the native Indonesians were so much better that they went instead. Their journey on boat to France lasted weeks, where they trained and devised strategies. The game took place in Reims, and the Hungarian dominance technically, tactically and physically was apparent as they wiped the floor of their opponents 6-0, Sarasi and Zengelia scoring twice. After the match, the Dutch East Indies captain wrote in his journal, "It was about the sport, which brings joy to life and does not degenerate into the grim faces of purely success-hunting diehards." So let's leave Reims and one of the most dominant World Cup victories in history and move down south to Toulouse, where we saw one of the biggest shocks in World Cup history as Cuba battled Romania. A squad of amateurs, Cuba were hardly a great side. In fact, none of their team had ever even left the country. Their manager, Jose Tapia, had to be registered as a player just to make up the 16-man squad, and realistically there was no chance they would have made it through the qualification stages, but this certainly made an impact on this 1938 World Cup. Romania took the lead after 35 minutes, but to the surprise of many, they not only surrendered the lead before half-time, they'd actually go behind with 21 minutes remaining. However, Romania would equalise in the dying embers of the game thanks to former Hungarian forward Julio Baratki. The game went into extra time where both sides added 1 goal to the tally and a replay was required. What I find quite incredible about this replay is that even though he kept Cuba in the game, their goalkeeper Benito Carvajales was dropped for his understudy Juan Eyra. Carvajales actually backed Eyra and insisted they win, saying the Romanian game had no more secrets for us. We shall score twice, they will only score once. And against all the odds, he was right. Cuba won 2-1 and Eyra had a phenomenal performance. Cuba were incredibly into the quarter-finals of the World Cup. Finally, the game of the tournament, Brazil versus Poland. For the first time ever, Brazil actually arrived at a World Cup full strength and had real aspirations of winning the thing. Poland were also at full strength, however aspirations were not as high. So it was no real surprise when Brazil ended the first half 3-1 to the good. However, Poland had an ace up their sleeve in inside right Ernst Wilimowski. According to RSSF, Wilimowski scored 1,077 goals in his career, including a season where he scored over 100 goals. A year after the World Cup, he'd become the first player to score 10 goals in a game, and according to German icon Fritz Walter, Wilimowski was the only player who could score more goals than opportunities. It was quite clear that Wilimowski was a goal machine, and he really showed it in this game by scoring Poland's next 4 goals. However, it wasn't quite enough, as 2 goals from hat-trick hero Leonidas gave Brazil the 6-5 win, the highest scoring game in the World Cup so far. With huge tension surrounding Europe at the time, Italy versus France was a huge fixture, and it was actually the first time in World Cup history we'd have the hosts face the holders. As both sides wore blue, the Azzurri wore their fascist black shirts with a fasciolatorio symbol on their badge, despite protests they'd been receiving in France. Italy made 3 changes for the game, including one of their 1934 World Cup winners, Geraldo Monzeglo, who wouldn't play again, but not only in the World Cup, but for Italy. A good friend of Mussolini and tennis coach of his sons, Monzeglo was dropped at the request of the Italian Football Federation president, Giorgio Vaccaro. France remained unchanged, whereas Italy, as I said, made 3, including taking out goal scorer in the Norway game, Pietro Ferraris, and bringing in Gino Colausi, who actually opened the scoring in this game after 9 minutes, largely thanks to a horrible error by the French keeper. France equalised 1 minute later, however the lethal Piola scored a second half brace, dragging Italy into the semis with a 3-1 victory. A couple of less dramatic games now, starting off with Hungary versus Switzerland in Lille. Not much is said about this game, however it did sound competitive and Hungary won the game 2-0. After their replay win against Romania, Cuba set up a quarter-final tie with Sweden. We were playing well and felt we were favourites going into the game, explained Juan Tuñas, nicknamed Romparedes, netbreaker in English. But then something happened that we hadn't bargained for. It rained and the pitch was sodden. We weren't used to conditions like that and we kept slipping over, he added. Sweden won a record 8-0, with Gustav Wetterstrom and Harry Anderson both scoring hat-tricks. Finally, the most insane quarter-final, the Battle of Bordeaux, Czechoslovakia versus Brazil. The game was incredibly ill-tempered, mostly thanks to the very lax refereeing. A record 3 players were sent off, 1 for Czechoslovakia and 2 for Brazil, including their own captain, Martin. The game finished 1-1 thanks to the goals of Leonidas and the 1934 World Cup top scorer, Oldrich Nehedli. However, Czechoslovakia were the biggest victims of this violence, as Nehedli and goalkeeper Planička left with broken bones, meaning they missed a replay just 2 days later. But then again, so did most players. Overall, 14 changes were made and both sides were completely unrecognisable. Brazil won 2-1, meaning the 1934 World Cup finalists were knocked out. Both semi-finals took place on the 16th of June, just 4 days after the quarter-finals, so we'll start off in Paris, as Hungary faced Sweden. Now remember, Sweden had a bloody easy path to the semi-final, no one and Cuba. Hungary were their first real test of the competition, and well, it started off great for them, scoring inside 25 seconds. Sven Jakobsson of Sweden scored the second goal, but it was into his own net, and Sweden capitulated. The first half ended 3-1 to Hungary. Sarosi and Zengalir scored 2 more in the second, and 5-1 was the final score. Hungary were in the World Cup final. For the final semi-final, let's move all the way down south to Marseille as Brazil faced future World Cup rivals Italy. The Seleção made 8 changes from their replay 2 days earlier. However, 2 games in 4 days clearly got the best of their top scorer and best player Leonidas, who didn't play in this game. Brazil actually went into this game as favourites, however according to reports, Italy were the stronger side, and in the second half Colausi scored his second goal in 2 games. This was followed up by an incredibly comedic Miazza penalty, where his shorts fell down as he stepped up. The elastic that held the shorts up had broken, so they fell down just as he was about to step up to take the spot. He still scored. Romeo pulled one back for Brazil with 3 minutes remaining, but it was too little too late, and Italy were World Cup finalists for a second time. On the 19th of June, Brazil faced Sweden in the third place playoff in Bordeaux, the scene of the Battle of Bordeaux, and it was an absolute cracker. Sweden started off incredibly strong, taking a 2-goal lead after 38 minutes. Nevertheless, Brazil showed why they came into the World Cup as one of the favourites, as they scored 4 unanswered goals, with Leonidas adding 2 more to his ever-growing tally. And now for the final, current champions Italy versus Hungary. This game was a huge deal, and apparently Italy received a telegram from Mussolini himself saying win or die. This likely didn't happen. In fact, according to Pietro Rava, they did receive a telegram from Mussolini, but it was to wish them good luck. The final was held in the Stade Olympique de Colombe in front of 45,000 people, and the game was refereed by Frenchman Georges Capdeville. Italy had made 0 changes, whereas Hungary made 4. Creeping in at the back post, Gino Colausi, who'd become a revelation since coming into the squad, gave Italy the lead after 6 minutes. However, Hungary replied instantly through Paltikos. Yet, Italy were dominant in the first half, and the scoreline showed it. By half-time, the Azzurri were 3-1 up. Piola got the second, and Colausi the third, becoming the first player ever to score a brace in a World Cup final. Sadosi pulled one back for Hungary, but Serie A's greatest scorer, Piola, put the icing on the cake. Italy won 4-2, becoming champions of the world for a second time in a row, beating Norway, host France, Brazil, and Hungary. An incredible run. This World Cup was certainly an entertaining one. Leonidas top scored with 7 goals, Hungary were doing hungry things, and with an average of 4.67 goals per game, no 0-0s and no 1-0s, it was the highest scoring World Cup yet, with 84 goals. Italy's win also saw them become the first non-host to win the World Cup title, and Silvio Piola's 82nd minute goal in the final would be the final World Cup goal for 12 years.